Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into one of the most notoriously complicated, deeply debated topics in all of modern history, the origins of World War I. If you've ever tried to really untangle exactly how this global catastrophe started, you already know it's not a simple story. I mean, unlike World War II, this just wasn't a clear-cut case of a single belligerent nation or a dictator pushing everybody else to take a military stand. There's really no easy villain to point a finger at here. Instead, it forces us to unpack the underlying structures of European power at the turn of the 20th century.
So, we have to ask the core question: what actually caused World War I? When the guns finally began to fire in 1914, the conflict entirely lacked the moral vindication of resisting a tyrant. There was no single evil empire to defeat. Instead, millions of people were literally dragged into a meat grinder of a war, driven by an incredibly complex underlying geopolitical web that had been quietly spinning for decades. The road to war wasn't paved by one bad guy, but by miscalculations, intense paranoia, and secret agreements.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the idea that Europe at this time was a delicate but toxic balance of structural forces, essentially a giant tinderbox just waiting for a spark. No single nation woke up one morning and caused the war in a vacuum. The entire continent had become highly flammable over a period of decades. The eventual assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand? Well, that was merely the match dropped into a wildly explosive room. Today, we're going to break down exactly what made up all that combustible material.
Okay, let's dive into this. To understand how this tinderbox was built, we'll use the MAIN acronym as our structural map. Militarism, alliances, imperialism, nationalism, and finally, we'll look at the spark and the domino effect.
Starting with the M in our framework, number 1, militarism and the arms race.
Militarism in the late 19th and early 20th centuries was about so much more than just having a standing army. It was a pervasive, everyday ideology. Imagine knowing your neighbor is constantly stockpiling weapons. If France built 10 new artillery guns, well, Germany felt the absolute immediate need to build 20. It created this relentless culture of paranoia that really heightened the desperate search for allies. And what's even more fascinating, and honestly tragic, is that this was all fed by a widespread cultural belief that war was actually a good thing for nations. It was seen as a perfectly necessary way to build character and national pride.
By 1914, we see these massive marching armies, representing an incredible, unprecedented global arms race. Germany had actually seen the greatest increase in their military buildup. But it wasn't just about the sheer number of soldiers, boots on the ground. It was really about the men at the very top. In Germany and Russia particularly, the military establishment began heavily influencing public policy. You had generals and commanders constantly whispering in the ears of politicians, ensuring that military readiness took strict precedence over any kind of diplomatic solution.
And this brilliantly illustrates the tension, the intense naval race between Germany and Great Britain. Germany made a highly concerted effort to expand its navy just to actively challenge the British. Now, the reality was that this naval race was never really a true contest. Britain successfully maintained its long-standing naval superiority without breaking much of a sweat. However, the British obsession with naval dominance was so incredibly strong that even the mere attempt by Germany caused massive political friction. Governments on all sides used wildly exaggerated rhetoric to justify expanding their militaries. There was this simple, extremely dangerous naivete among these leaders. They genuinely did not comprehend the potential scale and bloodshed of a modern European war, and that totally blinded them to checking their own aggression.
Moving on to the A, number 2, alliances and the tangled web. Between 1870 and 1914, Europe practically split down the middle into two massive, heavily armed camps. On one side, you had the Triple Alliance, formed in 1882, linking Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. On the other side, the Triple Entente, finalized in 1907, which bound France, Britain, and Russia together. But here's the kicker. These weren't just friendly handshakes. These were strict mutual defense treaties. They basically meant that if one country got attacked, their allied countries were bound by law and national honor to jump in and defend them. You can already see the trap being set, right?
So Europe was fundamentally divided into these mutual defense camps, and they were fueled by some really deep-seated historic conflicts. For instance, Austria-Hungary and Russia had completely incompatible interests regarding territory down in the Balkan region. Meanwhile, France harbored a deep, lingering suspension and flat-out resentment of Germany, which was firmly rooted in their humiliating defeat during the 1870 Franco-Prussian War.
After 1870, Germany's Chancellor Bismarck actually set the precedent for this whole messy system by playing neighbors off one another to maintain a balance of power. But as we know, that balance was incredibly precarious.
Let's look at the I and the N of our acronym. Number 3 and 4, Imperialism and Nationalism.
Imperialism is basically the practice of increasing a country's power and wealth by bringing outside territories under their control. Fired up by the rapid rise of industrialism, European nations were completely desperate for new markets and raw materials to feed their constantly growing factories. Africa and parts of Asia became massive points of contention. The increasing competition and just this insatiable desire for greater global empires inevitably led to more confrontation, pushing these industrializing countries closer and closer to the brink.
By 1900, the tentacles of new imperialism had reached right across the globe. Colonies were essentially used as units of exchange, basically bargaining chips that could be traded without directly affecting the European homeland, but which constantly brought rival nations into diplomatic conflict. The massive expansion of the British and French empires caused some serious resentment over in Germany. So Germany aggressively pursued its own imperial policy in the late 19th century just to catch up, which really only added a thick, heavy layer of mutual suspicion among all the great powers.
Now, clashing directly with those massive empires was nationalism, a super powerful, highly disruptive new source of tension. Just think about the Habsburg Empire of Austria-Hungary for a second. It was a tottering agglomeration of 11 different nationalities, all squeezed within one border. It was like a giant Jenga tower. Large Slavic populations in places like Galicia and the Balkans had nationalist aspirations that completely countered any sort of imperial cohesion. Specifically, the Slavic peoples in Bosnia and Herzegovina intensely desired to leave Austria-Hungary and be part of an independent Serbia. This aggressive Serbian nationalism created the absolute perfect storm in the Balkans, which was already a highly volatile region where Russia also had some very deep historic interests.
So, the crucial point is right here. Number 5, the spark, the assassination.
In June of 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, who was the direct heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, traveled with his wife Sofia down to Sarajevo. Sarajevo is in Bosnia, which was a territory controlled tightly by Austria-Hungary, but heavily populated by Serbian nationalists who desperately wanted out of the empire. So, as you can imagine, it was a remarkably high-risk visit in an incredibly volatile, politically charged environment.
And unfortunately, that visit ended in total chaos and tragedy. A Serbian nationalist terrorist group known as the Black Hand Gang had secretly sent operatives to assassinate the Archduke during his motorcade procession. Now, their first attempt actually failed when the Archduke's driver managed to speed up and avoid a grenade thrown right at their car. But in a truly bizarre, almost unbelievable twist of fate, later that same day, the Archduke's car took a wrong turn and literally stalled right in front of one of the conspirators, a young man named Gavrila Princip. Princip seized the totally unexpected moment, stepped right up to the car, and fatally shot both the Archduke and his wife at point-blank range.
And that brings us to the aftermath, the July crisis domino effect.
Let's move to and see how this builds, because once that first move was made, the rigid alliance system kicked in like an automated machine, creating a truly terrifying domino effect. This single localized assassination was interpreted by Austria-Hungary as official Serbian government policy. So on July 28th, Austria-Hungary declares war in Serbia. Because Russia is allied with Serbia, Russia immediately begins to mobilize its massive army. Seeing this, Germany, allied with Austria-Hungary, declares war on Russia on August 1st. Because France is allied with Russia, they are automatically drawn in, and Germany declares war on France on August 3rd, immediately invading through neutral Belgium to get to Paris. This explicit violation of Belgian neutrality pulls Great Britain, an ally of France and the sworn protector of Belgium, into the war on August 4th. Literally in just one single week, a regional dispute dragged the entire globe into total war.
Which leaves us with this final, incredibly profound question to think about. Was the war truly inevitable? Or was it just the devastating product of an alliance network and a misguided belief in glorious war? Every single nation played a part in building the complex machinery that caused World War I. But what proved most devastating of all was that fatal combination of rigid defense treaties and a naive pre-1914 myth that war was a glorious, effective tool for nation-building. By the time the trenches were dug and the millions of casualties were counted, that myth of the glorious war was left entirely dead in the mud. Thank you for exploring this history with me on The Explainer today, and keep questioning the narratives that shape our world.